Welcome back everybody to linuxacademy.com. My name is Terry, and in today's course we continue our preparation for the Linux Foundation Certified System Administration exam. What we're going to be talking about now is doing things like how to monitor our system, troubleshoot our system, and more importantly, to generate system reports on usage and user activity on demand. So there are a large number of utilities that we can use to do any of these topics, and we're only going to talk about a handful of them and not in a ton of detail. This is meant to be a jumping off point for you to explore the particular tools. So if you're asked some of these questions, you'll at least have a place to start in producing this information in these reports. So for example, if someone were to come to you and say, I need to know what's currently eating all of the CPU cycles on the system. It seems sluggish. Everyone's heard of the top application. The top application tells us a bunch of different things about our system. It tells us things like the CPU utilization overall for the system. And then it breaks it down by system processes, nice processes, what's idle, what's in wait state, what's a zombie, what's a system state, etc. It tells us the number of processes that are running in total. It tells us how many are running, which in this case is just X windows. Everything else is sleeping. It tells us what's sleeping, how many users are logged in, how long it's been up, and what the load average is. And there you'll see a lot of definitions for what load is, but very simply, load is a representation of the available resources of a system based on the number of processors or cores that are available, and then the processes that are using them, meaning that right now, based on the total number of cores on my system, it doesn't make any difference. A load of 1 would mean that I'm using 100% of one core on my system. So right now, I'm only using about 3% of one core on my system. Now, if I see a load average of anything above 1 and I've got one CPU, then I would be looking at things to free up CPU processing power, or I would be looking at adding resources. Conversely, if I see a load of 1 and I know that I have 4 CPUs on the system, then I'm only using really 25% of the capacity of my system in terms of what it can handle from a load perspective. So the easiest thing to do is how many CPUs do I have and what is my load? Now, obviously, there are other factors, including disk and memory utilization, but a general rule of thumb is if your load is less than the number of cores that you have allocated to your virtual or physical system, your system can probably handle what's going on. It'll also tell you things like the size of the swap, the size of the swap, and the memory. But there's an easier way to get to memory, and there's also a cleaner way to look at what's running on the system. So if you are running on any system, there's another utility called htop that you'd have to install. In our case, since we're running on a CentOS 6 system, we're just going to do a sudo yum install on htop. And htop is more of it is terminal based, so it's ncurses based, but it's a cleaner, nicer, colorized version of top that updates nice and cleanly with graphing that shows you a little more detail about the different cores that you have on your system and how each one of those cores are engaged in the load that's currently being generated for your system. So you'll have an idea if you've got 2 cores or 4 cores, how engaged each of those are on a second-by-second basis. And we can do that by doing htop. And it tells us, and I know right off the top of my head now, that I have 2 cores on the system. They're both lightly utilized. I have a little under 4 gigabytes associated with my, in this case, virtual machine. I'm only using 640 or 600 megabytes of it. I have a, looks like 8 gig swap partition, of which I'm not using any, so I'm not overrunning memory. And my load is light. I have 104 processes, 106 processes, which only 1 are running. And I've been up for about 36 minutes. These are all the processes. We're not going to go into a lot of how to manage processes. We've got an entire video for that later in the course. So what if I just want to know how much memory I have? Well, if I use the utility called free, for example, it'll tell me things like how much memory I have, how much swap space I have, how much shared space and buffers. And here's what's what's interesting about the memory. So if I do a free minus M, I get a little bit nicer format for me to read. So I can say I've got about 3.8 gigabytes of memory, 1.1 is used, 2.7 is free, 630 is cached. If you start to see that you've got a bunch of used memory and not a lot of free memory, but a ton in the cached space, then you still haven't run out of memory, because cached memory is simply memory that's using to speed up your file system. So files are cached in memory if memory is available for files to be cached. It's called paging. So if you have a file system that is a little bit slower, and disks are always slower than in-memory processes are, it'll cache those files to memory. However, your system will page those file reads and writes to disk and use memory for processes as needed. You don't need to do anything. Your kernel is responsible for either managing the file cache in memory or managing processes in memory. So there's nothing that you need to do, but it'll give you an idea of what your memory is engaged in doing, how much is engaged in processes versus how much is engaged in file caching. Speaking of files, there's a couple of things that we can do. So if we take a look at the df utility, it tells us all of our existing mount points, how much free space, used space, and available space we have, and what percentage they're in use. That particular format's a little hard to read, so let's make it in a human readable format. We just do a df minus h, and it tells us in gigabytes